Welcome back to the library, dear wanderers. Today we're going to head back to Library Wing 1, the Hidden Nest, back to the First Oak's shelf, where we'll pick up the first work we see. It was brought to the library by Troy L. Now without further ado, Venom. Arnold didn't care for the happy little Chinaman that handed him his breakfast, nor for the attitude, one he interpreted as sarcasm, that seemed to drip from his voice when he wished a good day. Then again, Arnold didn't care for most people. They were, after all, tragically flawed in one way or another, usually through their own idiocy or their frantic need for contact with other human beings. His day became worse when he stepped on the train and found himself seated across from a young chatty woman who found his suit, tie, and umbrella all quite fetching. She said so half a dozen times, and each time it took all of Arnold's self-control not to get up and get off the train at the next station to try his luck. Once, he sat across from a man who'd never even raised his eyes to look at his traveling partner. Arnold considered that one of the best days of his life. As the woman got up, she looked at him, tilting her head sideways, the clucking in concern. "You should go to the doctor," she recommended. Arnold didn't ask why, but she volunteered the information anyway. "Your neck looks swollen. Might be the mumps." When she left, Arnold let out a long, slow breath and closed his eyes, silently thanking any deity that would listen. He had worked out a path 6 years ago that, if walked, only required him to acknowledge 4 people on the way into the office. 4 weeks ago, he discovered that arriving 15 minutes earlier, which train's scheduling had transformed into 30 minutes, allowed him to reduce that number to 3. He greeted Carl, the security guard, and Darren, the elevator operator, with the terse nod and good morning that had left his lips at the start of each day. At his floor, he nodded to Nancy, the receptionist, and then continued down past the empty desk at the end, blissfully pattyless, and to his office, where he sat down and communicated through memos with everyone who needed it that morning. After that, he quietly drank his coffee, ate his breakfast, and read the morning paper while the first group of return memos arrived via messenger boys, who had learned to leave their lips sealed. On the way to lunch, he mistimed his exit, finding Patty sitting at her desk and looking intensely sad. He turned, planning to order food in, when she caught his attention. "Oh, Mr. Cheese!" He turned her. "It's cheesed," he said for the uncountable time, flatly, finding it hard to swallow. She nodded. "Yeah, sorry," she apologized. "I was waiting to let you know that I wouldn't be in." "Thank the gods." "Because my father just passed away and I have—" "Get on with it." "To go take care of family affairs." "That's fine. Take all the time you need." He could manage without her. She thanked him, then stopped and stared for a moment. "Are you coming down with something, sir?" she asked. He frowned. "No, I feel fine." "Oh, it's just your neck, sir. You look a bit swollen." He stared at her for a moment, then nodded. He walked into his office, glanced at himself in the small mirror he kept in a drawer, and then sighed. Another memo copied to his supervisor and the Human Resource Department, informing them that he was taking an additional hour for a medical visit, and then a phone call, blissfully short, to schedule the appointment. When he got up and walked out, he was pleased that Patty was gone. Less for him to do then. He'd let someone else, a secretary or someone, take care of the flowers and condolences. If he was lucky, they'd sign his name for him. Looks like the mumps, the doctor said, nodding slightly and getting out a pad. You'll be out of work for a few days, and you should get a nurse to watch you, he recommended. It's dangerous to have them as an adult. Arnold stared at him. I can't be off from work right now, he said. You're going to have to be. It's not the mumps. You're more than welcome to go to another doctor, but they'll tell you the same thing. I feel fine. You have the mumps. The second doctor agreed, and the third. Finally, with a bitterness that felt like it was rising to his throat like bile, he phoned the office to let them know the situation. The woman who answered felt it necessary to wish him a speedy recovery rather than simply acknowledge the illness, and he found himself wanting to find a way to have her fired. He would, he decided when he returned. Ending the first call, he talked to an operator and got the number for a nursing agency, hired one to come round and monitor him 3 times a day. You want to be safe, don't you? The second doctor had said, shortly before he went to the third, and make sure he didn't need to be hospitalized, which was plausibly the worst of all possible fates at this point. He made himself a drink, tossed it back, and walked up to his room to lay down. Hopefully, when the woman arrived, she would do her duty and leave. Hello, Arnold, she said, chipper to the point that he was actively resisting striking her. How are you feeling today? She was also using his first name, which made him even more annoyed. Tolerable, he said, swallowing hard to choke down the spit that had suddenly formed in his mouth. Good, good, she said, pushing him down onto the bed. His shoulders were on the pillow, and he was rapidly finding the situation intolerable. She fluffed the pillow behind his head, then insisted on putting a warming pad around his throat to ease his discomfort, or some other nonsense. She fluffed his pillow, with him still on it, then pulled up the blanket and hurried to get him a cup of tea. And when she came back, he had to hear about her family. Oh, my son, Sheridan, he is away at university. My husband, that's Gerald. I told you about Gerald, didn't I? She had her third husband. She told him again anyhow. Anyhow, my husband Gerald and I were so proud of him. He wants to become a doctor. Said when he did that, he'd get to order his mother around. And I said to him, you may become a doctor, but I'm not too old to tan you. She laughed. He was certain the feeling in his ears was blood. And we laughed and laughed and laughed. Oh, you've not touched your tea. She got up, then put an arm around him, pulling him up and insisting on holding his tea to his lips and tilting the cup back to make him drink. It was too weak and now tepid. He grimaced slightly when she interpreted as pain. She rushed to get him a new heating pad and a pill. He sat up in bed, coughing hard after she left, looking down at the neon green mucus on his hand with distaste. He reached for a napkin, wiping it off, then tossing it in the trash, and then she was back. Here we are, she said, pushing him back down in the bed again. He gagged for a moment, feeling the phlegm enter his mouth again as she pushed the fresh heating pad around his neck. And then she was sitting down again, talking. Talk. Her first husband, Reginald, had died in a car accident when she was pregnant with her oldest, Elliot, who she never saw anymore because he ran off with some boy he met in the army, and that was something she just couldn't truck with. She'd tried, but in the end, she hadn't been able to, and Jesus wouldn't have improved anyhow, so there was that. And then there was her other son, Mickey, who had died when he was 3 after her second husband, Samuel, had a heart attack while driving. And Samuel hadn't lived long past that. But then she'd met Gerald a year or so later, and things were so much better with Gerald. And even Elliot had thought Sheridan was simply wonderful, and though she pretended not to know, she knew that Gerald still quietly sent Elliot Christmas cards with little letters about how Sheridan and she were doing. But even then, water, he begged. He wasn't begging because he was thirsty. She leapt to her feet, fetching him a half-full glass, then sitting down beside him and pulling him up in much the same way she had done earlier with the tea. He was shaking, which she believed was a chill. When she pulled away and halfway through insisting him back down to the bed, he snapped. "Get your hands off me, you incessant, nattering cunt!" It happened on a cunt. With his mouth open and gaping in rage, eyes screwed up, that a line of green liquid shot from his throat. It hit her between the eyes, then instantly seemed to wash over her face. She fell backwards, thrashing on the floor and trying to push herself up, slapping at her face and trying to get the strange liquid off. It was the color of bile, and as he sat in his bed, he watched her writhing and screaming on the floor. He didn't rise to check on her until she'd stopped. 10 minutes later, and by then, well, maybe Gerald could finally have a moment's peace. He worked rather automatically, wrapping 2 old belts around her, then carrying her down the stairs of his house and out to the car. When he dropped her in the trunk of it, he realized he was wearing his pajamas still. With a blush, he walked back into the house, trying to keep his dignity. He was back at work the next day. It was free of Patty still, and he found himself silently praising whatever mad bureaucrat had come up with bereavement pay. Hopefully, she'd cash in on every dime. He sat down at his desk, scratching out the memos with a small amount of delight in the regularity of the task, then sending them out again. He smiled. Actually smiled, and relaxed into his chair, enjoying his coffee and the fresh biscuit that he had with it. The swelling was gone, and he felt good. For the first time in ages, he felt actually good. It really was bad to bottle up everything inside yourself, after all. Sometimes you just had to let it out. A story of toxicity and keeping things bottled up inside. Lovely, but also a little bit disgusting. On to the next work, which is a shorter one. A short poem with sadness and love. By Miyabul. I think that's how it's said. Anyway, let's get right into the poem. Flower. I love the smell of the meadow in spring. The sky was alight with laughter and good cheer, and my darling dear was beside me. She smiled and looked at me, amber eyes shining in the sun as she marveled at me, sunflower in hand. She had asked me, "Do you still like yellow?" And I had replied, "Yes." And she was smiling wider, the edges of her amber eyes crinkling with laughter, as she parted her pink lips and laughed so softly. My heart did a flutter, and I knew that I loved her. We stood in a meadow of sunflowers and daisies, the sunflowers growing tall and the daisies growing lazy. We had walked in that meadow for all night before I got down on my knee and asked if she would be mine. And in that moment, I would miss how she laughed, how she looked at the world as a brilliant shade of yellow, color never being absent from her or light. We moved into a house, and we planted sunflowers all around the house and inside. The more the better. And one day, I came home, but the sunflowers were no longer yellow. They were gray, splattered with red, and my world seemed to shatter. My heart stopped in my chest, and my eyes, they soon wandered to a sinking of the garden where my beloved had wandered. Upon her neck had been a gash, her innards spilled out into the daisies and onto the yellow, her life force dripping out. She was pale as the sun on that calm meadow day, where I'd asked her if she wouldn't mind if we'd stay together forever, till God's grace we did pray to separate and let us live apart if it was great. But now the garden we worked so hard for seemed barely enough to live for. And I collapsed then, body among the sunflowers, which hues of yellow, vibrant amber, slowly faded and mellowed. There was no joy here now. I no longer wished for the meadow, for my darling dear was gone, and so was the color yellow. A lovely little poem, as I do so often say. Now on to the next work, which would be The Magpie Leaves Its Nest Fleeing Winter, but we've already read that in MaxiFran73's author spotlight, and I do recommend you check it out. But with that aside, we shall move on to the actual next one we will be reading, which is brought to the library by Anaxagoria. Now, without further ado, Gods of Money. The Grand Ducal Palace of Lower Gregoria was an impressive edifice. Covering over 50 city blocks, it was an engineering marvel and a monument to overpowering greed. To the passerby, its flying buttresses, climbing towers, and aesthetic spires would evoke comparisons to the Taj Mahal and the Chrysler Building. To the hapless beggar, its cunning security systems and endless supply of guards would evoke comparisons to Fort Knox or a nuclear missile silo. To the unfortunate UN human rights investigator, or more unfortunate prisoner, these sordid prison cells and sadistic jail keepers would evoke comparisons to Nazi Germany. But if anything could match the grandeur of the outside of the palace, it would have to be the squalor of the surrounding city. All the wealth of Lower Gregoria went into its construction, and it was indeed all the money. 100% taxation and squads of grime-eyed collectors saw to that. When the money ran out, High Duke Alexei just ran off more in the mints, taking the textiles of the country along with the wool from the clothes of any peasants foolish enough to resist. Massacre money, the international media called the new Gregorian dollars, but no one took any action. Now the building was complete and the city around it in ruins. Winter was coming, so the people lit mountains of Gregoria $1,000 bills for warmth. They had more money than they'd ever imagined. After the money worked its way back into the now trashed economy, but they couldn't even buy a loaf of stale bread with it. 1,000,000% inflation will do that to you. In the palace, though, Stale bread was present only in the croutons. Here, the Duke showered his opulence on the loyal ministers and wheeled through his latest excess. He didn't like to go against his advisors, so he made sure that they agreed with him. Now the Minister of the Mint reeled back, shocked by the Duke's latest proposal.
But,
He sputtered.
there isn't enough. We can't make another palace, much less one larger than this one. There simply isn't enough money. No one will lend us the cash. The people certainly can't pay, and...
See to it that they do, said the Duke, slipping out through the crowd. For some reason, he was very tired, and so decided to duck out. He wouldn't be missed, and the lips of dissenters were always looser when they didn't think he could hear them. The recording devices would help ensure a large number of arrests. When Duke Alexei arrived in his bedroom, which in any lesser building would qualify as a ballroom, the guards turned aside, brought out the ducal fingerprint scanner, an inelegant device but effective, and unbarred the burnished steel doors over a foot thick. All precautions taken, Alexei entered his room, where anyone besides the Duke entering would be killed by the additional guards in the room. The security system was one of the best in the world, as evidenced by the continued survival of one such as the Duke, which is probably why he was so surprised to see, when the doors closed behind him and the lights came on, the corpses of all 10 guards and to hear the voice behind him. He wheeled with surprising speed, drawing a revolver he carried at all times and firing it at the creature, calling his name above the door. The bullet sank into its skin without any sign of an effect, and Alexei got a better look at the creature. It was snake-like, with a tail splitting into many parts, each tipped with a wicked-looking barb, the thing dangling from the ceiling fixtures, and horribly, it spoke.
Alexei Dazakovsky, you have nearly killed me, so I must kill you. You make my people turn away from me. I am starving, Alexei, starving for their faith, and you destroyed that. Do you have any idea, Alexei?
The Duke shrank back, terrified, yet already planning escape. Just keep it talking, a small part of him said, when the rest was consumed with blind panic.
What are you? What have I done? What are you?
He screamed, scrambling away.
I am a god,
it hissed, leisurely swinging from chandelier to chandelier, keeping pace with him.
The god of the Gregorian dollar, and I am angry you've made the believers lose their faith. All I am to them now is cheap firewood. I have the strength of the currency, and now I am so weakened by this loss of value. You will die for this.
Some small part of this reached the doomed Duke's mind as he backed into his bed. Now, directly above him, the monster began to unfold its bladed tail.
What? There is no god of the dollar. That's absurd.
Alexei asked, puzzled, despite the imminent danger.
How am I not a god?
It roared.
I have my faithful. I have power. All currencies are based in blind faith. They all have gods, just as surely as I am one. The yen, it has believers the world round. It is mighty indeed, and faith is all that is needed to make a god. But I am weakened. You have ruined me with your palace. The people, the masses, they no longer hold me in esteem. Look in the streets. They burn my being to eat them in the coming winter. Is this the respect I am due?
It paused, then resumed, its voice now building in bitterness.
I am weakened, true, but I will still destroy you and glean some satisfaction from your death. I may still live on, which is more than would be the case if you built another of your damn castles. You are an ant compared to me, but a dangerous one indeed. You shall not survive this day.
With that, it flipped off the swaying chandelier, landing impossibly lightly on the bed. Its claws sped, and the last thing Alexei noticed was that the god's hide had the pattern of money on it, but looked to be not paper, but human skin and flesh. Shortly having cleaned its barbs, the god gazed around the room in rage and disgust, climbing out and away through the hole it had ripped in the reinforced chamber. It slunk off to wait to die of lack of faith when the currency would finally collapse. Lower Gregoria was quickly rescued from its situation, with Duke Alexei dead. Humanitarian organizations swarmed over the area, removed and destroyed most of the remaining money, and brought in a new currency with actual value, though also in the end backed by faith. Lower Gregoria gradually returned to a modicum of prosperity, and after a while all signs of the old century, Mad Duke Alexei's country, Lower Gregoria gradually returned to a modicum of prosperity, and after a while all signs of the old country, Mad Duke Alexei's country, vanished. It is worth note, however, that many years later, with almost all Gregorian dollars having been destroyed, those few remaining became prized collector's pieces, and so in a cave in the mountains at Lower Gregoria's border, something stirred, invigorated by newfound value. Think about it. If currency is entirely predicated on the basis of faith, then is it not a god? But that's all the time we have for today, dear wanderers. Thank you very much for coming. Good luck out there, and I do so apologize for getting this out so late.